Keweenaw Peninsula, Michigan, September 1878. The air, thick with the scent of pine and turning birch, carried the first hint of the coming iron. Up on the slope of the Quincy mine workings, where the earth was scarred red from copper ore, a man was engaged in a strange and solitary labor. His name was Jory Trelawney, and he was digging a hole where no hole should be. It was not a root cellar, nor the beginnings of a new foundation. He was driving a tunnel, straight into the hillside, directly behind his small, newly built cabin. The dimensions were precise, like a mine adit, 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, shored up with timber hewn from the surrounding forest. He worked with the practiced economy of a man who had spent his life underground, his movements efficient, his tools an extension of his will. To the other miners and their families, it was baffling. They built against the cold, not into it. They chinked their logs with moss and mud, banked their foundations with earth and snow, and laid in cords of hardwood against the siege of a Keweenaw winter. Jory Trelawney was inviting the frozen heart of the mountain into his home. Dale Prewitt, the mine foreman, stopped by one afternoon, his face a mask of professional skepticism. Prewitt was a man who understood rock, stress, and the unforgiving physics of gravity. He watched Trelawney haul a sledge of red dirt and rock from the tunnel mouth, his brow furrowed. "Trelawney," he began, his voice accustomed to being heard over the din of stamp mills, "the company pays you to drill and blast for copper ore, not to burrow like a groundhog behind your own house. What in God's name is this foolishness?" Other men gathered, leaning on their tools. Elias Vance, a timberman, gestured with his axe. "You'll have the whole slope down on your roof come spring thaw, Jory. That's a fool's errand." "It's just plain crazy," muttered Tom Gundry, shaking his head. "Digging a tunnel to let the winter in." Jory Trelawney paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the dark opening, then back at the men. He didn't argue or defend. He simply said, "The winter's not in the rock." He then turned and went back to work, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel the only answer to their mockery. The foreman, Prewitt, shook his head in disbelief. He saw a waste of skill, a dangerous ignorance of geological stability. The other men saw a Cornishman's madness, an eccentric obsession that would surely leave his family to freeze. What did this quiet tin miner, a man from a land of mild drizzle and green hills, understand about the brutal thermal warfare of a Lake Superior winter that a seasoned mine foreman and a community of hardened frontiersmen had missed? This question hung in the crisp autumn air, unanswered. To find the answer, you have to understand that the men mocking Jory Trelawney saw the mountain as a solid, frozen enemy to be kept at bay. But Jory saw it as an ally, a reservoir of constant, dependable warmth, and he was about to prove it. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the simple, elegant physics behind his strange tunnel, and you will see how one man's quiet conviction can reshape a community's understanding of survival. So stick with me. And let me know in the comments below. What's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Jory Trelawney was not a carpenter. He was not a logger, nor was he a farmer. He was a man of the deep earth, a son of Cornwall, where his father and his father's father had gone down into the tin and copper mines of the St. Just district. His hands did not know the fine art of the dovetail joint, but they knew the grain of granite, the heft of a drill steel, the precise smell of black powder, and the subtle shift in temperature that signaled a change in the rock strata. He had spent his youth in the Levant mine, working levels 1,000 feet below the crashing waves of the Atlantic. Down there, the air was always the same. In the searing heat of August or the biting gales of January, the rock held a steady, breathless warmth, a constant 55 degrees. It was a law of the earth he had absorbed into his bones. He had come to Michigan's copper country with his wife, Alara, and their 2 young children, Lowen and Morwenna, drawn by the promise of high wages and the familiar work of hard rock mining. They arrived in the late autumn of 1877, just as the peninsula was beginning to lock itself into the ice. They built their cabin hastily, a single room of green sawn pine, chinked with what they could find. They did what everyone else did. They bought a cast-iron stove, laid in a massive woodpile, and prepared for the cold. They were not prepared. The first winter was a relentless education in misery. The problem wasn't just the cold, it was the quality of the cold. It was a physical presence, a predator, that seeped through every crack and nail hole. The floors were like slabs of ice. Alara kept the children on the bunk beds, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Jory would wake in the deep of night to find his own breath pluming in the air, a faint cloud hovering just above his pillow. In the morning, the water in the basin would be a solid block of ice. His leather work boots, left by the door, would be stiff as iron, and he would have to work them by the stove for 10 minutes just to get his feet inside. The single pane of glass in their window was a canvas of thick, opaque frost from November to April, a blind eye staring out at a world of white. They burned wood at an astonishing rate, feeding the hungry stove day and night. The small cabin was a paradox of thermal extremes. A circle 10 feet around the stove was blisteringly hot, while the corners of the room remained frigid, and drafts, invisible and insidious, snaked across the floor, chilling them to the bone, even as their faces felt flushed from the fire. Jory watched his family. He saw the persistent cough Morwenna developed, the pale, pinched look on his son's face. He saw Alara, a woman of resilient spirit, grow quiet and weary, her life reduced to the endless, exhausting task of fighting a battle she could never win. This was not living. It was a state of siege. That winter, Jory Trelawney didn't just feel the cold. He studied it. He diagnosed it. And he knew, with the certainty of a master craftsman, that his neighbors were fighting the wrong enemy. The conventional cabins of the Keweenaw, for all their rugged appearance, were thermodynamic failures. They were designed to fight the cold with brute force, specifically with fire. The central flaw was the air they breathed. A wood stove is an engine that runs on combustion, and combustion requires oxygen. To get that oxygen, a stove inhales vast quantities of air from inside the cabin, which it then exhales up the chimney stack, along with the smoke and waste heat. A typical stove could pull the entire volume of air out of a small cabin every single hour. This created a powerful vacuum effect. To replace the air being shot up the chimney, new air had to be drawn in from the outside. And in a Keweenaw winter, that outside air was often 10, 20, or even 30 degrees below zero. This replacement air was the enemy. It was the source of the relentless, ankle-biting drafts. It screamed in through every unsealed gap, the space under the door, the cracks between the logs, the loose-fitting window frame. The families were engaged in a futile cycle. The more wood they burned to get warm, the more freezing air the stove sucked into the cabin, which in turn made the cabin colder, forcing them to burn even more wood. They were trying to heat a river of Arctic air that was flowing constantly through their living space. A thermometer might read 65 degrees at chest height near the stove, but it would read 35 degrees on the floor by the wall. It was this temperature stratification that made life so miserable. The children were perpetually cold because they lived their lives closer to the frozen floor. Jory saw his neighbors suffering the same fate. He saw Dale Prewitt's wife stuffing rags into the gaps of their walls, as he heard Elias Vance complaining that he was burning through 2 cords of maple a month and his children still slept in their coats. The problem wasn't the quality of their stoves or the thickness of their walls. The problem was the source of their air. They were importing the very enemy they were trying to defeat, inviting it right into the heart of their homes, dozens of times a day. Jory knew he couldn't stop the flow of air. The stove needed to breathe. But he wondered, with a miner's logic, if he could change where it came from. He didn't need to fight the winter. He needed to go under it. And so in the late summer of 1878, Jory began to build. He chose the spot behind his cabin with care, on a gentle slope of compacted glacial till and rock. He began his tunnel not as a digger, but as a surveyor, reading the land. He wasn't just burrowing. He was engineering a solution. He laid out his plan for Ilara one evening, sketching on a piece of scrap lumber. "The earth, see?" he explained, his finger tracing a line. "It holds the summer's warmth, down deep. The frost can't reach it. The rock stays the same, winter or summer." Ilara looked at the drawing, then at the determined set of her husband's jaw. "A tunnel, Jory? Into our home?" She trusted him, but the idea was strange, unsettling. "What will the neighbors say?" "They're already talking," Jory said with a slight smile. "Let them. This is for us." He began the excavation with a pick and shovel, tools he could wield for 10 hours straight without tiring. The first 10 feet were the hardest, cutting through the dense topsoil and web of tree roots. Once he was deeper, and the earth changed to a mix of clay, sand, and stone, the overburden left by ancient glaciers. He worked methodically, timbering as he went. He used cedar for the posts and caps, knowing its resistance to rot. The design was a classic mine adit, a flat bottom, vertical posts, and a thick cap timber across the top. Every 4 feet, a new set of timbers went in, lagged with thick planks to hold back the surrounding earth. Dale Prewitt made his visits a regular occurrence, his skepticism hardening into a kind of professional outrage. "You're using mine-grade timbering, Trelawney," he declared one afternoon, inspecting a perfectly set cap. "That's a waste of good cedar. And you're not accounting for hydraulic pressure. When the melt comes, this whole passage will flood and the pressure will buckle your walls." Jory didn't look up from his work. He was leveling the floor of the tunnel, ensuring a slight, almost imperceptible, upward grade toward the cabin. "It won't flood, Mr. Prewitt. It'll drain." "And the slope stability?" Prewitt pressed, his voice rising. "You've cut a wound in this hillside. You're a good miner, Jory. You know what a fault line can do. You're compromising the integrity of the entire bank. It's irresponsible. You're putting your family at risk for a mad notion." "The rock is sound," Jory replied, his voice calm and low. He tapped the wall with his hammer. The sound was a dull, solid thud. "This isn't fractured shale. It's compacted till it holds itself." The criticism was relentless, a daily chorus of doubt. "He's digging his own family's tomb," Elias Vance told the men at the mine head. The work was slow and arduous. 40 feet. It was the length of 2 freight wagons, a formidable distance to dig and shore by hand. It took him nearly 2 months, working in the evenings and on Sundays. The pile of excavated earth behind his cabin grew into a small hill itself, a testament to his singular focus. Finally, the day came when the tunnel reached the back wall of his cabin's foundation. He had planned this from the start. The foundation was made of fieldstone, and he had left a section with weaker mortar. With a heavy sledge and a cold chisel, he carefully knocked a hole through the stone, a perfect 2-foot square opening connecting the dark, earthy passage to the space beneath his floorboards. The final step was inside the cabin. He pried up a section of the floor near the wall, away from the main living area, and framed a simple wooden vent, covering it with a heavy iron grate. The work was done. A 40-foot-long, timber-lined tunnel now connected the deep, stable earth of the Michigan hillside directly to the air inside his home. As the first cold winds of November began to blow, the mockery reached its peak. Jory Trelawney's Fool's Tunnel was complete. Now all he had to do was wait for the winter to pass its judgment. To understand why Jory Trelawney was so certain his tunnel would work, you have to understand a fundamental law of the planet. The Earth is a colossal thermal battery. All summer long, it absorbs energy from the sun. This heat penetrates deep into the ground, warming the soil and rock. While the surface temperature fluctuates wildly with the seasons, the temperature deep underground remains remarkably stable. This phenomenon is called geothermal energy, and its power lies in its constancy. In a place like the Keweenaw Peninsula, the winter air temperature can plummet to 40 degrees below zero, and the ground can freeze solid to a depth of 5, even 6 feet. This frozen layer is known as the frost line. But below the frost line, the Earth never freezes. It holds onto its stored summer warmth, maintaining a steady temperature all winter long. In that region, the deep Earth temperature is consistently between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Jory knew this not from a textbook, but from lived experience. Every tin miner in Cornwall knew that once you descended past the first few dozen feet, that the mine was a refuge from the weather on the surface. It was this simple, profound truth that his neighbors, for all their frontier experience, had failed to grasp. They saw the Earth's surface, which was frozen and hostile. Jory saw the Earth's core, which was a vast and reliable source of moderate heat. His tunnel was, in effect, a simple but brilliant heat exchanger. It was an artificial cave, long enough to tap into that deep Earth warmth. The 40-foot length was critical. The first 10 to 15 feet of the tunnel would be cold, influenced by the outside air. But as air traveled deeper into the passage, it would be surrounded on all sides by walls of earth that were a constant 55 degrees. Heat naturally flows from a warmer object to a colder one. The 55-degree earth would steadily warm the cold air moving through the tunnel. Let's consider the numbers. On a day when the outside air was 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the air entering the mouth of Jory's tunnel would also be 0 degrees. By the time it had traveled 20 feet, the surrounding earth would have warmed it to around 30 degrees. By the time it reached the end of the 40-foot passage and entered the cabin through the floor vent, that same air would be approximately 50 to 55 degrees. The Trelawney cabin still had a wood stove. It still needed to draw in air to replace what went up the chimney. But instead of sucking in 0-degree air through the cracks in the walls, creating frigid drafts, the stove now pulled its replacement air from a single, dedicated source, the floor vent. It was now inhaling a steady, gentle stream of 55-degree air. This had two immediate and powerful effects. First, it eliminated the cold drafts. The vacuum effect was now satisfied by the tunnel, so freezing air was no longer being pulled in from elsewhere. The cabin became a sealed, quiet space, free from the invisible currents of cold that had made the previous winter so unbearable. Second, it dramatically reduced the load on the stove. Heating 55-degree air to a comfortable room temperature of 68 degrees is vastly easier and requires far less fuel than heating 0-degree air to that same temperature. Jory was giving his stove a 55-degree head start. He was preheating his house using nothing but the free, inexhaustible energy stored in the mountain itself. Dale Prewitt had accused him of digging a tunnel to let the winter in. The truth was the precise opposite. Jory had dug a tunnel to keep the winter out. The winter of 1878 arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an assault. In mid-January, a weather system of immense power stalled over Lake Superior. For 9 consecutive days, the Keweenaw Peninsula was subjected to a lake-effect siege. The wind howled out of the northwest, a constant punishing gale that drove the temperature down to 35 degrees below zero and kept it there. The air was filled with a blinding torrent of fine, dry snow that erased the world, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. It was a whiteout, a storm of legendary ferocity that shut down the mines, isolated homesteads, and pushed every family to the brink of their resources. For most, it was a repeat of the misery Jory's family had endured the year before, only magnified. In Elias Vance's cabin, the frost on the inside of the walls was an inch thick. His family lived in a small huddle around their stove, which glowed a dull red day and night. They had burned through a third of their winter wood supply in that 1 week. The children were sick, their sleep punctuated by hacking coughs. Inside the Trelawney cabin, a different reality was unfolding. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking around the corners of the house. But inside, there was a profound and unsettling calm. The drafts were gone. The floor, once a sheet of ice, was now merely cool to the touch. Elara could walk from the stove to the far wall without feeling a sudden plunge in temperature. Little Morwenna's cough had vanished. The children, Lowen and Morwenna, were not confined to their bunks, but were sitting on a blanket on the floor, playing with carved wooden toys. The single window pane had a delicate filigree of frost at its edges, but the center was clear, a small, blurry portal to the white chaos outside. They were still burning wood, but the consumption was shockingly low. Jory would add a single log to the stove every few hours, maintaining a small, steady fire. The stove was no longer fighting a desperate battle against an invading army of cold air. It was merely topping up the warmth in a calm, stable environment. The true test came from the vent. A steady, gentle current of air flowed up from the iron grate, silent and invisible. It had no chill. If you placed your hand over it, you felt not a draft, but a neutral coolness, a stark contrast to the knife-like cold that would seep under the door if Jory opened it for even a second. This was normalcy, was achieved under the most extreme conditions. Elara baked a loaf of bread, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the entire cabin, a domestic comfort that would have been unimaginable the previous winter. They were not just surviving the storm, they were living through it, warm, safe, and together. Jory sat at his small table, mending a piece of harness leather. He could hear the wind trying to tear their home from the mountainside, but inside, the only sound was the quiet hiss of the fire and the soft breathing of his children. The mockery of the autumn seemed like a distant memory from another world. The mountain was holding them in its steady, 55-degree embrace. On the 7th day of the siege, Dale Prewitt had to make his way from the mine captain's office to check on a pumping station that was in danger of freezing. It was a short distance, less than a quarter mile, but in the blinding whiteout, it was a perilous journey. The wind was a solid wall, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into any exposed skin. He navigated by memory, moving from one landmark to another. Halfway there, a powerful gust knocked him off his feet, and he lost his bearings in the swirling whiteness. He was disoriented, his face numb, the first insidious signs of frostbite beginning to set in. He knew he was near the row of company cabins, and he stumbled forward, hoping to find any shelter. Through a momentary thinning of the snow, he saw the dark shape of Jory Trelawney's cabin, its roof piled high with a massive drift. He staggered toward it, his only thought to get out of the wind. He fell against the back of the cabin in the small, sheltered space between the log wall and the mouth of Trelawney's Fool's Tunnel. And then he felt it. In the lee of the cabin, the wind was diminished, but the air should have been just as brutally cold, a soul-crushing 35 below zero. It wasn't. As he huddled against the foundation, he felt a presence, a subtle but undeniable change in the air around him. It was a gentle, steady exhalation, coming from the dark, timbered opening in the hillside. There was no wind, just a slow, constant current of air flowing out of the tunnel. It wasn't warm, not like a fire. It was something far more profound. It was air that had no cold in it. He expected the rock and timber around the tunnel mouth to be coated in thick frost. They were bare. A distinct line was visible on the ground. The snow was deep everywhere else. But for a foot around the opening, the ground was merely damp. Driven by a sudden, urgent curiosity, Prewitt pulled off his thick wool mitten. He reached out and placed his bare palm against the stone lining the entrance. He braced for the searing pain of contact with frozen rock. The pain never came. The stone was cold, but it was a dead cold. Not the vicious, biting cold of the exposed world. It felt exactly like the rock deep in the mine. He leaned closer to the opening, turning his face to the outflowing air. It smelled of damp earth, of clay and stone and deep places. It was the smell of the mine, the smell of safety. In that moment, freezing and disoriented in the heart of a blizzard, Dale Prewitt understood. His entire conception of the world, of heat and cold, and the very nature of the earth, reconfigured itself. Trelawney hadn't dug a tunnel into the winter. He had dug a door into a place where winter could not reach. After the storm broke, Prewitt, his face still raw with windburn, walked to Jory Trelawney's cabin. He didn't knock. He stood for a moment, then walked to the tunnel entrance. He knelt, just as he had in the storm, and felt the air. Then he walked to the front door and knocked. Jory opened it. "Trelawney," Prewitt said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Can I come in?" Inside, the warmth was absolute. It was a quiet, even heat that filled the entire space. Prewitt's eyes scanned the room. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw the clear window. His gaze fell on the iron grate near the wall. He walked over to it and crouched down. The dirt floor immediately surrounding the vent was dark and damp, as completely unfrozen. It was a small circle of thawed earth, a miniature springtime in the dead of winter. This was the proof. This was the undeniable, physical evidence that broke through his professional certainty. He looked up at Jory, his face a mixture of awe and contrition. He struggled for words, the foreman's bluster completely gone. "You didn't dig a tunnel," Prewitt said, his voice low and heavy with revelation. "You opened a vein in the mountain." Jory simply nodded. There was no triumph in his eyes, no, "I told you so." He had never been in an argument. He had simply done what he knew to be right. "The stove needs to breathe," he said. "I just gave it better air." The conversion of Dale Prewitt was more powerful than 100 successful experiments. He was the foreman, the expert, the loudest and most credible skeptic. When he began to talk, the men listened. He didn't just recant his mockery, he became the tunnel's fiercest advocate. He explained the principle to the other miners, not in terms of physics, but in the language they understood. "It's like a ventilation shaft," he told them, "but one that brings in warm air instead of cold. Jory's using the whole mountain as a stove." The news spread through the mining community, carried on the cold winter air. It was the mine physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, who gave the innovation its official seal of approval. A thoughtful, observant man, he had noticed a marked improvement in the health of the Trelawney children. While he was treating case after case of pneumonia, bronchitis, and severe croup in the other company houses, the Trelawney family remained stubbornly healthy. He visited the cabin, a thermometer and a hygrometer in his bag. He measured the temperature in the corners, on the floor, near the ceiling. It was remarkably consistent, with a variance of less than 5 degrees. More importantly, the air had a higher, healthier humidity, a result of the air passing over the damp earth of the tunnel. the brutal dryness of the air in other cabins, heated by red-hot stoves, was a major contributor to respiratory illness. Dr. Finch made a formal report to the Quincy Mining Company. His conclusion was direct. The Trelawney system, as he called it, provides a constant supply of pre-warmed, naturally humidified air, significantly reducing fuel consumption and creating a measurably healthier living environment. He officially prescribed the installation of these geothermal vents in the new block of company housing being built the following spring. By the summer of 1879, a dozen families were digging their own tunnels into the hillsides behind their homes, with Jory Trelawney and a newly enthusiastic Dale Prewitt offering advice on timbering and siding. The mockery of one autumn had become the standard building practice of the next. Jory Trelawney's tunnel is more than a clever piece of frontier engineering. It serves as a powerful reminder of how modern building science often rediscovers principles known to resourceful individuals centuries ago. What Jory created was, in essence, a passive geothermal heat recovery ventilator. Today, we use sophisticated systems with buried loops of plastic tubing and electric fans to achieve the same effect. These earth tubes, or ground-coupled heat exchangers, are considered a cutting-edge component of sustainable, energy-efficient home design. They pre-cool air in the summer and preheat it in the winter, reducing the load on HVAC systems and saving energy. Jory Trelawney had no advanced machinery, no knowledge of BTUS or thermal conductivity coefficients. He had only a deep, intuitive understanding of the Earth, gained from a lifetime of working within it. He demonstrated that the most powerful solutions are often the simplest, relying on working with the laws of nature rather than fighting against them. His tunnel anticipated the core concept of modern geothermal climate control by nearly a century using nothing but cedar logs, a shovel, and a profound respect for the planet's inherent stability. The story of Jory Trelawney's tunnel is about more than just heat. It's a parable about the nature of wisdom. The community on the Keweenaw Peninsula was filled with experienced, intelligent, and capable people. Their knowledge, however, was confined to a specific set of problems: how to build with logs, how to fight the cold with fire, how to survive on the surface. Their expertise became a form of blindness, preventing them from seeing a solution that lay just a few feet beneath their frozen boots. Jory's wisdom was different. It came from another place, from the deep, dark, and constant world underground. He saw the mountain not as a barrier, but as a resource. He didn't see a solid, inert mass of rock and dirt. He saw a living system with its own breath and its own warmth. The theme he lived by was simple. The mountain never stops giving. You can take from it, blasting its rock for the copper held within its veins. But you can also ask of it. You can ask it for shelter. You can ask it for stability. You can ask it for warmth. Jory Trelawney didn't conquer the winter. He simply asked the mountain for a door, and the mountain let him in. It's a profound lesson. Sometimes the greatest innovations come not from inventing something new, but from understanding something ancient. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to the Keweenaw Peninsula. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history and practical wisdom. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of old world knowledge have you seen that provide elegant solutions to modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of geothermal air tempering. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering advice. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.